Well, let's turn in our Bibles then to Genesis chapter 1 and the first verse of the first chapter in the Bible. For those of you who haven't been through Genesis before, it will be a truly wonderful journey as we go through. Now, I read the King James Bible. You need to read the one that you'll obey. But our journey through the Bible is 3,568,489 letters. There, I told you need to take notes. It's 810,697 words, 31,175 verses, and 1,189 chapters. And the best place to begin is here. Now, we're not going to look at every one of these this morning, but just to get the flavour of it, let's read the first 8 verses, shall we? The first 8 verses. Verse 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens, or the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, 'Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters.' And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." So it starts by saying, "In the beginning, God." And if you can understand that, you're a long way to understanding a good many things. I have to say, I'm reminding of a story that Joe Foch tells. He was at a Calvary Chapel pastors' conference, and he was sitting there, and Pastor Don McClure walked in and sat down next to him. And Pastor Chuck Smith got up to speak and open up the conference. And he came up to the microphone and gave everybody that special smile that only Chuck can give, that just kind of blesses everybody before he even says anything. And then he just stood there, and he breathed for a moment, and he just kind of stood there waiting for divine assistance. And you could see him kind of tuning in to the Lord, Joe says. And then he said, "In the beginning." And Don McClure leaned over to Joe and said, "This is going to be a long one." Well, we've got a long way to go. The word Genesis in Hebrew means beginning. And that's exactly what this book is all about. First of all, we see the beginning of the universe. Then we see the beginning of the life forms within the universe, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of sin and death. And then we see the beginning of God's redemptive program by the beginning of a nation. Now, the majority of the book of Genesis has to do with God's redemptive program, God's redemptive plan. And it does that by immediately narrowing down the genealogies to one family from which all the nations of the world are to be blessed. Now, it's important for us to understand as we study it that at various places in the book of Genesis we will be given a list of the genealogies of the people that were born and the ages that they lived. And I want to say right at the outset that God did not intend to give us a complete genealogical record of all the families on the earth. Adam and Eve, for instance, had many, many sons and daughters. Their first 2 sons were listed because they were significant. Other sons and daughters were not listed. But then along came a son when they were 130 years old, whose name was Seth. And he was listed because it was from Seth that we're going to follow a line. Now again, Seth had many sons and daughters that are not listed. Only one of them is listed because that's where the family line is going to fall. And so each of them, although they had many sons and daughters, they're not included in the record because they have nothing to do with the redemptive story of God. And we're coming down from Adam on a particular geological line which will lead us to Abraham. And that's the purpose of these genealogical studies that we'll come across, because they're there to show us the line from Adam down to Abraham. But for many of the sons and daughters, there's no record, there are no names, there's nothing. Because they're not important to this particular story of redemption. And we'll see that only those that have to do with the redemption of mankind are followed. And sometimes even those are only followed for just a few generations, like Cain's, for instance. And then it's dropped because they really don't follow down into the redemptive plan of God. So we're just looking at that as we begin the book of Genesis. Now it starts by saying, in the beginning, God. When was that? How long ago was that? Well, you know, our minds can't just fathom or grasp how long. I mean, I can understand that infinity does exist, but I can't understand what infinity really is. I can't understand timelessness. How long is eternity anyway? I can't understand space either. You know, I can understand that it just goes out there and there's no end to it. I can understand that it's possible for time to go back and there's no beginning, and I can understand that time can go forward and there's no ending. But to really, really comprehend it is beyond my capacity and my limited faculties. In the beginning, God. Now, there are certain people, of course, who would like to eliminate that last word, because they really don't want to retain God in their conscience or in their minds, because their actions are opposed to what God has declared. And we see that with groups like the secular society, who are always called upon by the media when they need someone to vilify God. And the Bible is quite clear when it says, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. And the Bible in Romans chapter 1 speaks of them as professing themselves to be wise, they've become fools, changing the glory of an incorruptible God, fashioning their God like unto corruptible beasts and creeping things. And because they don't want to retain God in their minds, God gave them over to minds that were reprobate, devoid of God. And we see that. The trouble is, of course, if I eliminate God, I've got a problem. Because all I'm left with was, in the beginning was. In the beginning there was a mass of gases floating in space. Well, that's not the beginning. Where did the mass of gases come from? Where did the space come from? You know, David Rosevere used to talk about scientists that one day said to God, look, we've come so far along the road with our experiments, we are so clever these days that we can now create life too. And God said, I don't think so. And they said, yes, we can. We know we can do it. We are that clever now. And God said, well, okay, let's both create life side by side, shall we? And we'll see if what you say is true. So the scientist said to God, well, okay, well, you go first. So God took some earth and he breathed into it and he created a human being. And he said to the scientist, well, okay, then now it's your turn. So the scientists got themselves ready, they got their white coats on, they got all their equipment ready, and they gathered up some earth, and God said, no, wait a minute, what are you doing? And they said, well, we're creating life. And he said, no, not that way you don't. You get your own earth. You see? When we say that in the beginning God, I'm recognizing that it's not just here by accidental compression of gases and explosions and cooling off and the forming of planetary systems that and that a particular planet with special atmospheric conditions and hydro conditions made it possible to support a life form. And it just so happened that the Earth was 93 million miles away from the Sun, so that it didn't burn up. And it just so happened that the atmosphere became a combination of nitrogen and oxygen. And it just so happened that there was a balance of about 79 to 20, and with 1% of varying gases. And it just so happened that around the Earth there was a blanket of ozone, and it just so happened that there was a magnetic force as well that's encircling the Earth, also protecting it from cosmic rays. And it just so happened that there's about a 2/3 water to 1/3 land mass ratio, and it just so happened that in the water there was somehow a fortuitous combination of molecules and of proteins that happened to come together at the right time, at the right place, in the right proportions, under the right pressure, at the right heat, and so on, and spontaneously degenerated into the first cell. What is the chance of that happening? If you really try to figure that out, you'll find that the chances are so remote as to make it absolutely impossible. It just could not have happened that way. When we look at the universe, we can clearly see a design. Certainly, when we look at the human body, we can see a design as we study the various aspects of the body itself. The bloodstream, the nervous system, the human eye, and all of the apparatus that God's built in. All of the checks and balances cry out of the fact of design. And you